Have you ever wondered how much the Fair Housing Act has changed since it was passed in 1968 and what that means for the way we manage our communities today? Well, in honor of Fair Housing Month, we're diving deep into the past, unpacking what's changed, and looking ahead for where fair housing protections are headed. Hello, housing providers and property management professionals. Welcome to the Fair Housing Insiders. I'm your host, Michael Coughlin with the Fair Housing Institute, and today I'm joined by two incredible experts in this field. First, our resident fair housing attorney, Leslie Tucker, who brings years of legal insight and practical guidance for property managers. And we're also honored to welcome Kathi Williams, co-founder of the Fair Housing Institute and a fair housing attorney with decades of experience helping our industry understand and apply this law correctly. Thank you both for being here so much.
Yeah, great to be here, Michael.
Hey, Michael, I sure do like being retired, but I also like talking about my favorite topic, fair housing.
Well, you came to the right place. And since it's Fair Housing Month, we're focusing today on the core purpose of the Fair Housing Act, the evolution of enforcement and industry standards, and what we believe housing providers need to prepare for in the coming years. So let's start at the beginning because the why behind this law shapes everything that we do today. So, Leslie, for anybody newer to property management, or if they're just still curious or still refining their compliance training, how do you explain the Fair Housing Act in the clearest terms?
So the Fair Housing Act is obviously an incredibly important civil rights law. It was passed in 1968, literally days after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It was designed to eliminate discrimination in housing and give every person in the United States equal access to housing opportunities. Specifically, it prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, and then later expanded to include familial status and disability.
And those protections apply across nearly everything a housing provider or manager does: the advertising, the leasing, unit assignments, rule enforcements, and more, correct?
Exactly. What's interesting is that although the protected classes haven't changed since 1988, the interpretation of the law absolutely has. When I started in this field 40 years ago, disability-related complaints weren't even known. Today, over 50% of all fair housing complaints filed annually involve disability, most tied to reasonable accommodations. This shift tells us where the industry struggles and where training is very important.
Absolutely. And Kathi, since you've watched decades of enforcement evolve over the years, what would you say are the most significant changes you've seen?
Three big ones come to mind. First, enforcement became more sophisticated as time went on. Early on, testing programs were rare, and today, nonprofit fair housing organizations conduct thousands of tests each year, especially focusing on source of income, criminal history screening, and disability-related discrimination. Second, technology changed everything. Email communications, online ads, social media posts, these are now evidence in fair housing cases, and they've helped fair housing advocates uncover patterns of discrimination. And third and finally, we've seen a huge rise in litigation involving assistance animals, criminal background screening, harassment, and retaliation. These weren't even involved in fair housing cases at this rate, certainly 20 or 25 years ago.
And I would add that recent changes that HUD has implemented have left many in the industry wondering about oversight and enforcement of the Fair Housing Act. Believe it or not, complaints filed with HUD make up a pretty small percentage of the total number of fair housing complaints that are filed in this country every year. In addition to the state and local fair housing assistance programs, program agencies known as FIPs, there are also nonprofit fair housing agencies that conduct testing, investigations, and file lawsuits in state and federal court. These organizations are known as Fair Housing Initiative Programs, or FIPs. The reality is that these agencies process the vast majority of all fair housing complaints that are filed in this country, significantly more than HUD and the Department of Justice even combined. So these FIP agencies are fair housing advocacy organizations that can receive complaints, do investigations, conduct testing, and like I said, even file complaints or lawsuits on their own behalf or on behalf of an applicant or a resident. So these fair housing organizations processed approximately 75% of all complaints filed in 2023, filed by 20% by FAP organizations, 5% by HUD, and less than 1% by the DOJ. So I think that's a pretty big surprise to most people.
Yeah, I would imagine so. And so from what you guys said, it sounds like the job hasn't just changed. It's just become way, way more complicated than when we started.
Absolutely. But the fundamental principle hasn't changed at all. And that is treat everyone equally and remove barriers to housing access.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and jump into the future a little bit to our present day. And Leslie, what are the most common areas where property managers still trip up?
So 3 key areas that I see. The first is, not surprisingly, reasonable accommodations and modifications, especially with assistance animals. Many cases come from staff just not responding properly, requesting unnecessary documentation, or denying requests without doing a proper individualized assessment. Second, I think steering, whether it's intentional or unintentional. So even well-meaning comments like, you might prefer this quieter area over here, that can lead to claims. And third, consistency in enforcement. Your policies have to be applied uniformly and consistently, whether it's related to parking or noise or amenities, late fees, really anything that's part of your policies or practices. And I do want to emphasize that most violations today that I see aren't malicious. They're just procedural mistakes or outdated policies.
Right. And I think that highlights why training is everything in this industry. And often the frontline staff are the ones in situations where just a single sentence, just a wrong word here or there can really create a lot of liability for themselves and for the company. So now the big question is going into the far future here. So Kathi, what do you think the future of fair housing and enforcement looks like?
Michael, I think several trends in this area are already emerging. First of all, expansion of enforcement. With the shifts that HUD has recently experienced, more and more municipalities and local agencies have been and will continue to be involved more and more in enforcing their fair housing laws. Also, we have to continue to watch as we may also continue to see an increase in people seeking private lawyers when they feel that they've been discriminated against. Secondly, technology-based discrimination. Algorithms and AI used in tenant screening or digital advertising can create disparate impacts. Expect more scrutiny and new rules about this. Companies need to be aware that while AI and other technologies can be very useful in their day-to-day operations, they can also lead to inadvertent discrimination. At the end of the day, the humans behind the tool is still going to be held liable. So strict checks and balances are necessary. On a third topic, accessibility in aging populations. That's something I am very intimately involved with. With American population over the age of 65, projected to reach 80 million by the year 2040, we'll see more focus on physical accessibility and disability-related accommodations. And I will add that enforcement agencies are increasingly focused on systemic discrimination.
So that means that they're not just looking at individual acts here and there, they're analyzing patterns in data and policies and outcomes.
Which obviously leads us to property managers and the companies that they work for needing strong documentation, a consistent process, and ongoing training, not just once a year. Like I know we say it a lot, but it just bears repeating in this instance. So as we celebrate Fair Housing Month, it's clear that understanding the Fair Housing Act isn't just about compliance. It's about contributing to inclusive, thriving communities and honestly helping your company's bottom line. So Leslie, Kathi, thank you again so much for your insights and for helping our audience navigate this complex, ever-evolving topic.
Michael, it's always a pleasure to be here with FHI.
Always happy to have this conversation with you.
And to our viewers, thank you so much for joining us today. Stay tuned for more episodes where we break down what matters most in fair housing and property management. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, thumbs up, ring that bell for notifications so you can see more episodes like these, because there's a lot to come in 2026. We'll see you next time.